I'm very happy to welcome Michel-Antoine Xhignesse, who came all the way from Vancouver for this seminar. He is currently a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and some of his papers have been published on the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, on the British Journal of Aesthetics, and on the Journal of Social Ontology. And the title of his talk today is What Makes a Kind an Art Kind. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you for inviting me to give a talk here today. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you all. And by the way, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to see you all here. So today I want to talk about the ontology of art. And in particular, I want to ask, what is it about kinds, about some kinds, that makes them count as art kinds? Because there are lots of kinds out there in the world, right? There's tables and chairs, there's silver, there's gold, there's porpoises, there's music, there's sculpture, but only some of these kinds count as art kinds, right? Only some of these kinds are relevant to artworks. So why is that? What is it that makes that the case? What is it about those kinds that makes them count as art kinds? And in order to answer the question, I think we actually have to start with quite a simple premise. It's a premise that's more or less universally accepted by everybody working in the philosophy of art, at least as far as I can tell. And that's just the idea that every work, every artwork, belongs to an art kind. So, for example, if you consider Rossini's Moses, right, that's obviously an artwork, and it belongs to the art kind music. Or maybe opera. It depends on whether you think opera and music are separate art kinds. Similarly, Giotto's Kiss of Judas is obviously an artwork, and it belongs to the art kind painting. Although again, it's actually a fresco, and it's a little bit strange that we think of frescoes as paintings rather than as separate art kinds. But we can talk about that in the question period if you want. And finally, Italo Calvino's The Non-Existent Night is a novel. It's obviously an artwork, and it belongs to the art kind literature. So, I mean, it seems like, at least at face value, right, this is a pretty straightforward premise. It seems like for any artwork you care to name, it would be really easy for us to specify its attendant art kind, right? Where by art kind, all I mean is just something like its medium. Right? I'm just using the term art kind because there's a lot of baggage that comes with the language of medium. We tend not to use it very reflectively, and so there's lots of presuppositions that are built into it. I just want to avoid all those problems, so I'm just going to use the term art kind in a neutral manner to refer to something like a work's medium. But anyway, it seems like we're really good at identifying an artwork's attendant art kind. Right? We do this all the time. We don't have any trouble identifying movies as films. We don't have any trouble identifying music as music. We don't have any trouble identifying paintings when we see them. Right? It seems like it's actually quite easy for us to agree on what a given artwork's art kind is. And that level of agreement has pushed a number of philosophers of art, especially in recent years, to sort of reconsider their approaches to the ontology of art. I'm thinking in particular of Dominic McIver-Lopez, David Clowney, and Christy McGuire. But for the purposes of my talk today, I'm going to focus mostly on Dominic McIver-Lopez's account, simply because it's the most systematic of the accounts that are out there. And what Lopez and others have argued is that actually, when you look at the level of consensus that there is about art kind classifications, what you'll find is that there's a whole lot more consensus than there is over something like theories of art. Right? Philosophers are constantly disagreeing about definitions of art, necessary and sufficient conditions for art. We're constantly disagreeing about their theories of art. But it looks like we're not actually disagreeing all that much when it comes to identifying individual art kinds and their boundaries, right? Either as philosophers or as ordinary citizens. It seems like we can do that pretty regularly and pretty easily. So maybe what we should be doing is shifting the focus of our attention as philosophers from trying to give theories of art to trying to give accounts of individual art kinds. Because maybe what gives a work its art status, maybe it's not a theory of art. Maybe it's not a property of the work itself. Maybe all it is just belonging to a particular art kind, belonging to a particular kind. Right? So maybe art status is something that's derived from belonging to an art kind rather than from some broader theory of art. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is just give you a very quick sketch of Dom Lopez's view. In particular, I just want to introduce you to kind-centered analyses of art, not because I'm going to go on to argue that they're wrong, because I'm not, but rather because I think that, I don't think that they go far enough. I think that if you really push the kind-centered theorist on their theory, eventually you're going to come to some kind of explanatory bedrock. And when you get there, I think, then we'll start getting some really interesting answers to questions about the ontology of art. So, what does the kind-centered analysis of art look like? It's really quite simple. All it says is that an item X is a work of art if and only if X is a work in an activity P, and P is one of the arts. So if you consider Mary Cassatt's Glassy Apples, here on the left, obviously it's a painting. Painting is an activity that we classify as artistic, therefore Glassy Apples is an artwork. And we can perform the same kind of calculation for Douglas Copeland's Digital Orca, which is just a statue at downtown Vancouver. It's a statue, which means it's a work of sculpture. Sculpture is an activity that counts as one of the arts, therefore Digital Orca is an artwork. So that's the kind-centered analysis in a nutshell, right? The idea is just that a work's art status derives from its kind membership, right? That's it. Lopez calls this strategy a buck-passing theory of art, and the idea is just that we pass the explanatory buck down from theories of art to individual art kinds, theories of individual art kinds instead. So the idea is that instead of having to give an answer at the level of theory about what it is that makes something an artwork, instead we can give an answer at the level of its kind membership. And that seems like an easier move to make. So that's the theory in a nutshell. As I said, it's really quite simple. For the next, let's say several minutes, quite a few minutes in fact, I want to take some time to just go through some of the main objections that have been raised against kind-centered analyses of art. And the reason I want to do that is not because I think that these objections are decisive, but rather because I think that when we examine the way in which the kind-centered theorist tries to address them, what we'll find is that they're actually starting to point to that explanatory bedrock I mentioned earlier. They're starting to point in the direction of a much more interesting and much more sophisticated analysis of what it is that makes a kind, an art kind, in the first place. So there are three main objections. We can call them the coffee mug objection, the free agent objection, and the structural objection. And the coffee mug objection is actually an objection that Lopez raises against himself. And it basically just says that it sort of seems as though not every single entity that falls under a given art kind is an artwork. Now that's a problem, because you'll remember that according to the kind-centered analysis of art, right, kind membership determines art status. So if it turns out that there's some object that falls under a kind, which is supposed to be an art kind, and yet it doesn't count as art, that's a problem, right? That's a counterexample. So here's a potential case for you. On the left, you have a standard mass-produced coffee mug that you can order on the internet. It's got a small joke about Donald Trump's tweets on it. I like to call it the Kofifi mug. And it's just an ordinary coffee mug, right? You're just supposed to drink coffee out of it, maybe get a laugh out of the joke, but you're not supposed to spend a whole lot of attention looking at it, thinking about it, anything like that. Right? You're not supposed to really appreciate the mug beyond maybe appreciating the lame joke. It's not usually considered an artwork. Right? It's just a regular coffee mug. We don't think of coffee mugs as artworks. On the other hand, on the right, the mug that you see there is a piece of beeswax. And beeswax is actually often considered art. Right? You can find beeswax displayed in galleries and museums. And if you go to Japan, what you'll find is that there's a whole practice of appreciating beeswax for its aesthetic properties. So here it seems we have two works which seem to share a kind, right? They're both works of ceramics, and yet only one of them counts as an artwork. Only the beeswax counts as an artwork. The Kofifi mug doesn't. Why is that? Is this a proper counterexample? Lopez's response is actually quite straightforward. He just says, look, we shouldn't be identifying art kinds with the work's physical or its vehicular medium. Right? So the problem here is just that we've been conflating different ways of talking about a work's kind or its medium. Right? We can talk about a work's physical medium. Yeah, they're both works of ceramics. But that's not quite getting at the phenomenon he wants to get at. Lopez's idea is that an art kind is fundamentally an appreciative kind, which is just to say that it's characterized by a medium profile which calls for a particular kind of appreciative practice. And so his answer to the coffee mug objection is just, look, the besenware has an associated appreciative practice. It's that appreciative practice that makes it an artwork. That's why it fits into an art kind. The Kofifi mug doesn't have an associated appreciative practice. That's why it's not an art. So that's the answer in a nutshell. The trouble, of course, is that it doesn't really seem to actually be answering the question, right? Because it seems like we can run the exact same kind of argument against appreciative kinds as we ran against art kinds in the first place. Namely, there are lots of different appreciative kinds out there, there are lots of different appreciative practices, but only some of them end up counting as being art relevant. Why is that? In point of fact, it's not entirely true that the Kofifi mug doesn't have any kind of associated appreciative practice, because it contains a joke, and you're supposed to get the joke, and you're supposed to chuckle, and then move on with your day, right? It seems like that's a kind of appreciation that's mandated by the mug. It's just that it's not the kind of appreciation that we normally think is associated with artworks. So it seems like there's a real problem here, right? It seems like the kind-centered theorist is going to owe us a much more detailed answer about what it is that makes a kind or that makes a practice count as art relevant in the first place. And the answer, I think, and this is looking ahead to later parts of the talk, the answer, I think, is going to have to be given in terms of conventions. I think that conventions are going to be the explanatory bedrock that does all this work for us. But that's yet to come. The second major objection is what Lopez calls the free agent objection. And the idea here is just that, well, you remember that starting premise where we said that every artwork has an associated art kind? Maybe it's not true. Maybe there are some artworks that don't have an associated kind, that don't have an associated medium profile. What might that look like? Well, what I've got pictured for you here are a couple pictures of Tracy Emin's work, Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, from 1963 to 1995. And what this is just a tent. And inside the tent, she's appliqued the names of every single person with whom she shared a bed, literally speaking, from her birth until what was then the present moment, so 1995. So there are about 102 names in there. Incidentally, the work doesn't exist anymore because it burned in a fire. So here's the thing, right? The question we should be asking here is, what kind of work is this? What art kind does it fall under? And you can be forgiven for thinking that it's a sculpture. After all, it's three-dimensional. You can walk around it. You can go inside it. You can sort of appreciate its aesthetic properties. But the trouble is that it doesn't really make for a very easy sculpture. It's kind of an uneasy sculpture. And the reason for that is that it does a whole bunch of things that sculptures don't normally do, right? So for one thing, it's not sculpted, right? Nor is it cast. So it's not really made in the same way that sculptures usually are. But more importantly, it seems like the proper appreciation of this work is not exhausted by its visible aesthetic properties, right? If you just walk around the tent and go inside it and read the names, but you don't move over to the plaque beside it that gives you the title, it seems like you haven't properly appreciated this artwork, right? It seems like the title actually does a whole lot of work to shape your proper understanding of the work. Right? The title is an integral part of the artwork because it forces you to start thinking about it in different ways. It seems like it's really important to the identity and the persistence conditions of this artwork that we entertain certain concepts when we engage with it, that we have certain ideas, that we think about it. Right? And that's not the sort of thing that sculptures are normally supposed to do. Right? Ideally, or normally, you're just supposed to sort of walk around a sculpture and get a sense of its visual aesthetic properties, and that's enough. But that's not enough in this case. So it's not clear that this is a sculpture. But if it's not a sculpture, then what is it? Is it a free agent? Lopez has two responses to this style of argument, to this charge, to this objection. The first is just to say, look, when you encounter something that looks like a free agent, you can always just assign it to an existing art kind. So in the case of Tracy Emin's Everyone, we could just bite the bullet and say it's a sculpture. But of course, as I've just been telling you, it's not clear that it is a sculpture, right? It does lots of importantly different things from what sculptures are normally supposed to do. In fact, it's its very status as a sculpture that's in question here, right? That's what it's challenging. The second strategy, and this is the strategy that he thinks we should adopt, is just to assign them to a new art kind of which they become pioneers. And he actually thinks that if we ever come up with any proper free agents, we can actually relegate them all to the category of conceptual art. Okay, so there are a few obvious problems, I think, with this strategy. The first thing I should say, though, is just that when it comes to Tracy Emin's work, I've sold you a little bit of a lie. It's not really a free agent. In fact, it's widely considered to be a very important work of conceptual art. So there is an art kind to which it belongs. It's conceptual art, it's not sculpture. But the reason I told you about Emin's Everyone is because I think that we can use it as the point of a very useful thought experiment. So imagine that Emin had presented Everyone for display in 1945. That's about 20 years before the development of conceptual art, right? Because conceptual art develops in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as a result of work by Isidore Guizou, Saul LeWitt, Vito Acconci, and so on and so forth. So if it's presented 20 years before there's any such thing as conceptual art, what is it? Then it seems like we actually do have a proper free agent, right? It doesn't seem to fit into any existing art kind. Lopez's strategy, as we just saw, will be to say, look, this is a pioneering free agent. It's the first of its kind, right? So yeah, there aren't any other conceptual artworks, but in this case, what you find is that it's the very, very first conceptual artwork, right? It's the one that gets the ball rolling. It's the one that gets things started. The trouble, of course, is that if you're a kind-centered theorist, then you think that a work gets its art status in virtue of its belonging to an art kind. And of course, when we're talking about pioneers, there is no associated art kind yet, right? Because there's no associated appreciative practice. The pioneer, by definition, is the one that gets the ball rolling. It's by definition the one that starts people thinking about it, that starts the development of the appreciative practice. But an appreciative practice is something that develops over time, right? It develops as a result of dialogues that people have with one another. It develops in response to certain moves that people make in this kind of language game. Which means that when a pioneering work is first presented, right, it doesn't have an associated art kind. It can't, by definition. Which means that it's not an artwork, according to the kind-centered theory. But the trouble is that none of us have a hard time recognizing these sorts of things as artworks, right? The only thing we disagree about is their kind classification. So what are we supposed to do? It seems as though the kind-centered theorist, when faced with something like the pioneering free agent objection, sort of shows their hand, right? They show that their argument is starting to look a little bit circular. So what they owe us then is a much more principled explanation of what's going on in the free agent case. And again, I think we're going to be able to develop that kind of explanation by appealing to a notion of convention. That's coming a little later. Finally, we have what I call the structural objection. And you'll remember that I told you at the very outset that part of the motivation for adopting a kind-centered analysis of art was just this idea that there's a lot more agreement about individual art kinds than there is about art in general. Right? Philosophers like to disagree about art, but it seems like we all more or less agree about individual art kinds. The problem that the structural objection raises is that upon closer investigation, it doesn't look like that's actually true. So when you start looking at what philosophers have written about individual art kinds, what you'll find is massive disagreement, not massive agreement. And in the cases where there does seem to be some agreement, it seems like it's mostly just due to the fact that the art kind in question is under-theorized. So philosophers, for example, have not spent a whole lot of time talking about printmaking. They haven't actually spent a whole lot of time talking about photography either, or dance, or even painting. I mean, we talk about painting a lot, but we don't actually talk about painting's ontology, right? So it's no surprise that if we don't really talk about something, there's an appearance of agreement. But as soon as philosophers start talking more about individual art kinds, what you start to find is massive disagreement. So here's an example. Take the ontology of music, which is probably the best developed literature in the ontology of art. Right? There's just loads of articles on the ontology of music. They're everywhere. Is a musical work definable in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, or is it not? Well, Jerry Levinson and Andrew Kania think it is, but Roger Scruton and Andy Hamilton don't. That seems like a pretty basic disagreement. Is a musical work an abstract entity, or is it a concrete entity? Again, Richard Ballheim, Nicholas Wolterstorff, Jerry Levinson, Julian Dodd, they all think that musical works are abstract entities. But Nelson Goodman, Ben Kaplan, Carl Matheson, Christy McGuire, they all think that they're concrete entities. So again, that's a pretty basic ontological disagreement. Are they repeatable or singular? Well, Julian Dodd will tell you they're repeatable. Alan Hazlitt will tell you they're not. Are they mental entities, as Collingwood and Diana Raffman have argued? Or are they historical individuals, as Guy Rohrbaum's argued? Are they actions or action types, as David Davies thinks? Or are they maybe some kind of Platonic abstract entity? Jerry Levinson, Peter Kibbe, Stephen Davies, Julian Dodd, these are all people who think that they're abstract entities. But unfortunately, they all disagree about exactly what kind of abstract entity musical works are, right? They've all got very different accounts of what musical works look like on that model. So it looks to me as though once you start pushing the concentric theorist on this point, right, they have to retreat, because there is no real agreement over very basic features of musical ontology. Right? It's not like we're disagreeing about abstract philosophical questions or really esoteric issues. We're disagreeing about basic properties of musical works. We can't even agree about whether they're repeatable or singular. That seems like a real problem. We can't agree about whether they're abstract or concrete. That seems like a real problem. So it seems like the motivation behind the turn towards a kind-centered analysis of art is a little bit suspect. Now, having said that, it's entirely open to the kind-centered theorist to say, well, hang on a minute, right? The mere fact that there's this disagreement about the nature of the boundaries of individual art kinds does not suffice to show that art status is not reducible to art kind membership. And that seems exactly right? I didn't bring up the structural objection because I thought it was a decisive objection against kind-centered theories of art. Instead, the reason I brought it up was just to show that I think we need to pay a little more attention to what's going on here. Right? We can't just accept the motivation at face value. And in fact, I think what this shows us is that the kind-centered theorist owes us a much better explanation of why it is that we both have this impression of widespread agreement, especially at the folk level, but then when it comes to actually scrutinizing the details of individual art kinds, we find massive disagreement. Right? Why is this asymmetry in our perceptions? I think they owe us an explanation of what's going on. Now, having said all that, I think that the solution to these problems lies in an account of conventions. And kind-centered theorists have been really hesitant to refer back to conventions to do this kind of explanatory work for them. But I think they've been hesitant for the wrong reasons. Mostly they've been hesitant because the traditional account of convention comes from David Lewis, and they think that it's inadequate. But we don't actually have to be Lewisians about conventions. So let me tell you a little bit about how I think we should be thinking about conventions. So as I just said, the standard account of conventions is Lewisian. And David Lewis tells us that conventions are self-perpetuating solutions to recurring coordination problems. Now this is important because for Lewis, coordination problems are a very technical notion. Right? He's not just saying that conventions arise out of any old cooperative activity. He thinks that they only arise in the context of coordination problems. And what a coordination problem is a situation in which two or more non-communicating agents are faced with a choice of actions, and where each agent's choice of a course of action is going to depend upon what the other agents do. So then we say that an equilibrium or a coordination equilibrium rather, obtains when no one agent would be better off by acting differently, provided that everybody else acted the same. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, especially when it's written out and I read it out to you. So let's just consider an example for a second. So here's a street in Vancouver. It's angled north-south. And I want you to forget, I mean, it's a really big street. It's got like 6 lanes, I think. Forget about 4 of those lanes, right? Just reduce it down to a 2-lane street going north-south. Okay? Now suppose that you're trying to drive down this street at a time before we have any established rules or laws about which side of the road to drive on. Right? If you're going to perform that activity, there's a few things you have to do. Right? What you want to be doing is driving on the same side of the road as either all or most of the people who are going the same way as you. Right? Because obviously if you drive on the wrong side of the road, you're going to enter into a head-on collision, and that's a bad thing. You don't want that to happen. So what you have to do then is you have to put on your thinking cap, and you have to anticipate what other people are going to do, right? Because what you want to do is to align yourself with what everybody else is doing. So you have to anticipate what other people are going to do, and you have to anticipate what other people are going to anticipate that you're going to do, and you have to anticipate what other people are going to anticipate that they're going to anticipate that you're going to anticipate that they're going to do, and so on and so forth, right? It iterates. Right? There's a whole lot of rationality involved here, right? You have to do some pretty deep thinking to figure out this puzzle. And of course, as you can see, that there are 2 obvious solutions to this problem, right? There are 2 states of equilibrium rather. Either everybody who's going north can drive on the right, or everybody who's going north can drive on the left. And similarly, everybody who's driving south can drive either on the right or on the left. Okay. Those are the only 2 ways in which you avoid a collision, or a potential collision. So that's a coordination problem, right? The choice of which side of the road to drive on in the absence of the ability to communicate with other people driving on the road, in the absence of any established rules about which side to drive on. So that's all a coordination problem is. But what I hope you've noticed is that this is a very narrow notion of a convention. It's not obvious that it's going to describe all the kinds of things that we regularly describe as conventions, especially in the art part. So consider this picture. So this is Parmigianino's Madonna with a long neck. You're probably familiar with it. It's the paradigmatic image when you open an art history textbook to the section on Italian mannerism. And what was going on in the Mannerist tradition was that